By 1944, the Second World War had become a prolonged and exhausting conflict. The European front stretched across ruined towns and devastated villages. On one sector of the Eastern Front, where forested terrain transitioned into rolling fields, positional fighting had continued for weeks. Both sides suffered losses, yet the area remained strategically important for supply and maneuver. In one of the border forests, cut through with trenches and craters from artillery shells, a small unit of soldiers found itself isolated. Their parent formation had been forced to withdraw after a powerful enemy offensive. The retreat unfolded under poor communications and constant air attacks. Several platoons lost their bearings and instead of following the planned route, ended up in territory already held by enemy forces. The unit was composed of soldiers of different ages. Some had been drafted recently and had spent only a few months at the front, while others had survived several campaigns. All had varying degrees of combat experience, but the lack of support, the absence of clear orders, and dwindling ammunition gradually deprived them of the ability to maintain organized resistance. An attempt to break through and reach friendly lines resulted in a clash with superior enemy forces. A short battle in the forest, shattered tree trunks, several disabled armored vehicles, and scattered equipment left behind a picture of chaos. The surrounded unit quickly ran out of ammunition. The radio was damaged, and communication with command was lost. When it became clear that further coordinated fighting was impossible, the commander ordered the men to cease resistance. On an improvised clearing, where camouflaged positions had stood only hours earlier, the first enemy groups appeared. The captured soldiers were led out of their hiding places and instructed to place their weapons and any items of military interest on the ground. The capture procedure was brief and silent. Prisoners were lined up in a column and moved through the forest toward a road where trucks were waiting. The faces of the captured soldiers showed fatigue, tension, and uncertainty. None of them knew what awaited them. Each relied only on rumors about captivity that circulated in the trenches. During the march toward the enemy rear, the column stopped several times. The prisoners were rechecked, their information recorded, and they were inspected for wounds. Many were in poor condition due to shortages and continuous fighting, yet few carried fresh, serious injuries. This suggested that they might be used later as labor or subjects for interrogation. At one collection point, located in a half-destroyed village, the unit spent the night. Burnt-out buildings without roofs, smoking chimneys, and ruined wells created an impression of total devastation. The prisoners were placed in a former barn where damp straw covered the floor. Guards were posted, though no open hostility was shown. By order of the local commandant, the prisoners received minimal food and water. Morning brought new movement. Part of the captured soldiers was sent toward a large transit camp, while another part remained in the village for questioning. This unit stayed behind. They were taken outside and lined up along the wall of one of the surviving buildings, just as a new enemy detachment arrived. It included field police and several staff officers responsible for maintaining order in the frontline area. The situation changed abruptly. The field police, known for strict methods, viewed captured soldiers not only as a source of information, but as a potential threat, particularly if they had participated in recent engagements. Reports coming in were inconsistent. One of them claimed that the captured unit might have been involved in actions that caused civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. In wartime, such accusations often led to harsh measures. A directive reached the local headquarters ordering a rapid review of the prisoners and the application of punitive action if the reports were confirmed. In practice, this frequently meant execution without a full investigation. By midday, the prisoners were moved to an open area outside the village. Trenches and improvised defensive structures stretched across the horizon. Staff officers examined field documents and intelligence notes. They possessed only fragmentary information from reconnaissance, a few statements from local residents, and several combat reports. This was insufficient for objectivity, but enough to create a dangerous situation. The prisoners were not informed of any official decisions, yet the setting, the units involved, and the place where they had been brought made many realize that the outcome could be fatal. Tension spread through the group. Soldiers assessed each other, recalled the recent battles, and tried to understand what had triggered suspicion. Given the harsh reality of wartime procedures, few believed in the possibility of a different outcome. It seemed that the decision-making process was already in motion and could not be stopped. In this environment, the influence of one enemy officer began to appear, an influence that would unexpectedly change the fate of the entire group. The group of prisoners stood on the open ground behind the ruined village, surrounded by makeshift trenches and earthen fortifications. The cold midday wind carried dust across the field, and the distant sounds of artillery reminded everyone present that the front was still shifting. The soldiers understood that the situation had reached a critical stage. The presence of field police, the hurried evaluation of documents, and the choice of location created an atmosphere that left little room for hope. Several staff officers walked between the guards, examining reports and trying to establish a consistent picture of recent events. They had only fragments to work with. Intelligence summaries mentioned clashes in nearby settlements, destruction of infrastructure, and the deaths of several civilians. The documents did not provide clear identification of the responsible units, yet the connection to the group now standing on the field could not be ruled out. In wartime, such uncertainty often worked against prisoners. The field police operated with a strict interpretation of frontline regulations. Their leadership viewed any captured enemy as a potential partisan or saboteur, especially in regions where civilian losses had been reported. The combination of unclear intelligence and rising pressure from higher command had created a situation in which officers often sought to demonstrate discipline through uncompromising measures. The prisoners sensed that the final decision might have already been made. Among the officers who arrived in the village earlier that day was a senior figure from a nearby divisional command post. His assignment was to inspect local security arrangements, evaluate the situation in unstable areas, and ensure discipline during the rapid movements along the front. Unlike the field police, his responsibilities focused on long-term stability rather than immediate punitive action. He reviewed intelligence reports with attention to detail, comparing dates, positions, and the movements of various units. The senior officer noticed several inconsistencies. The timeline of the alleged incidents did not match the recorded movement of the captured group. The reported destruction in the area had occurred prior to the unit's isolation. Civilian accounts referenced markings on vehicles that did not correspond to those used by these soldiers. The officer concluded that the evidence was insufficient to confirm the accusations. The captured unit appeared to have been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Despite these observations, the momentum of the punitive process continued. Field police representatives interpreted the situation through the lens of their own procedures. They argued that the presence of prisoners on recently contested ground was itself reason for suspicion. The senior officer requested access to additional reconnaissance reports and cross-referenced them with information from adjacent sectors. The more he examined the material, the more he recognized that the initial assumptions guiding the field police were flawed. The officer approached the commanding representatives on site and insisted that the prisoners could not be subjected to summary punishment without further investigation. He emphasized that the frontline conditions required careful judgment and that the executions of potentially innocent soldiers would undermine the stability of the broader region. The tension between the two command structures grew. The field police favored immediate action, citing operational necessity, while the senior officer stressed that haste in such matters often produced strategic setbacks. The officer examined the prisoners personally, not to address them directly, but to assess their condition and equipment. Their uniforms showed signs of extended combat and withdrawal. Their supplies were depleted. None carried items or insignia that suggested involvement in irregular activity. This observation reinforced his belief that the accusations were unfounded. He returned to the staff table and issued an official request for delay, stating that executions would be unjustified without confirmed intelligence. Regulations allowed senior officers to halt punitive actions temporarily if the situation required further clarification. The field police were reluctant but obligated to consider the request. A brief period of deliberation followed. The officer presented additional documentation and referenced divisional regulations regarding the treatment of captured soldiers. Gradually, the balance of authority shifted. The officer's rank, combined with the weight of his findings, forced the field police to reconsider. They agreed to suspend punitive action until a higher headquarters reviewed the case. For the prisoners, the change in atmosphere was subtle. Guards shifted positions. The tension in the air eased slightly. The surroundings did not become safer, yet the immediate threat seemed to recede. The men sensed that something had altered the course of events, although they could not understand why. By late afternoon, the order was given to move the prisoners back into the village perimeter. They were placed under guarded supervision rather than separated for execution. The senior officer called for additional intelligence personnel and began preparing a formal report. The fate of the captured soldiers was no longer controlled by field police intentions, but by a more cautious and analytical approach. What seemed inevitable in the morning had been postponed. For the first time since their capture, the soldiers had reason to believe that survival remained possible. Yet their future still depended on decisions that would be made far from the ruined village and far from the battlefield where they had been taken. The prisoners were returned to the ruined village and placed under guard inside a building that had once served as a workshop. The structure had no windows, and only parts of the roof remained intact. The conditions were harsh, but far removed from the open field, where their fate had seemed nearly decided. The sudden change in treatment signaled that the situation had entered a new phase. They were no longer candidates for immediate punishment. They had become subjects of an inquiry. The senior officer who had intervened began reviewing every available record related to the surrounding sector. He inspected operational charts, reports from reconnaissance patrols, and messages collected from local inhabitants. The goal was to determine whether any connection existed between the prisoners and the incidents reported earlier. Most of the fragmented intelligence suggested a pattern of confusion in the area. Units had moved quickly during the most recent engagements, often without proper coordination. Several settlements had changed hands more than once in a matter of days. The officer compared the prisoners' recorded route with the dates and locations of the incidents. Step by step, he reconstructed the timeline. The evidence suggested that the group had been retreating under pressure and had taken a path influenced by disrupted communications rather than deliberate intent. Damage to infrastructure had occurred before their arrival in the region. Civilian reports referenced vehicles and markings inconsistent with those used by these soldiers. None of the accounts placed the prisoners at the locations where violations had been noted. Additional intelligence officers arrived from a nearby divisional headquarters to assist. They questioned residents from nearby hamlets, inspected the remains of destroyed equipment, and collected notes from engineering teams who had surveyed damaged structures. Their findings reinforced the notion that several different units had operated in the sector and that the responsibility for the destruction remained unclear. The prisoners' unit had been caught behind shifting lines rather than conducting irregular actions. Meanwhile, the prisoners remained confined. They received small portions of food and water, enough to keep them in stable condition. Guards patrolled outside the building, and patrols increased at night. Despite the confinement, the tension among the men lessened. The fear that had dominated the previous day began to fade as the immediate threat of execution receded. They sensed that the fate of the group was now tied to bureaucratic processes rather than spontaneous battlefield justice. The senior officer continued assembling a detailed report. He emphasized that the accusations lacked direct evidence and that the rapid movement of units in the region had created conditions for confusion. He warned that unjust actions against captured soldiers could undermine discipline and trust within the broader command structure. In a period of mounting pressure across multiple fronts, maintaining coherence within the armed forces was essential. While compiling his findings, the officer also evaluated the tactical significance of the prisoners. None possessed high-ranking positions or specialized training that would justify extraordinary attention. Their equipment showed signs of prolonged retreat, with limited supplies and damaged gear. The condition of their weapons before surrender indicated that they had exhausted most of their ammunition and posed little operational threat. By comparing all available sources, the officer concluded that the prisoners were ordinary frontline soldiers who had been overtaken by the chaos of shifting lines. He prepared to send his report to a higher command post located several kilometers to the west, where senior leadership would make a final decision. According to procedure, the prisoners could either be transferred to a permanent camp or retained temporarily for additional clarification. Punitive action was no longer considered appropriate. Late in the evening, couriers carried the report through the fading light toward the divisional headquarters. The prisoners remained unaware of the precise details, but they sensed the shift. Guards no longer held their weapons with the same posture, and the atmosphere inside the building had changed. The men no longer expected immediate violence. The future of the group depended now on the judgment of officers far from the front lines. Their fate rested in administrative decisions rather than battlefield impulses. The events of the day had shown how quickly circumstances could change and how the intervention of a single officer could alter the course of many lives. The report reached the divisional headquarters late at night. Staff officers reviewed it while preparing updates for the higher command structure. The document contained a detailed reconstruction of movements, references to civilian accounts, and technical observations collected on site. The analysis presented a consistent conclusion. The prisoners could not be linked to the incidents that had triggered suspicion. The destruction in the region had multiple possible sources, and the timeline eliminated the captured unit from direct involvement. The headquarters confirmed that the front in this sector remained unstable. Several units had been forced into sudden withdrawals, and the communication lines had been affected by constant artillery strikes. Intelligence gaps were predictable under such circumstances. The leadership acknowledged that rapid punitive measures based on unclear information could result in significant errors. It was decided that the prisoners would not face execution. They were to be transferred to a controlled facility where they could be processed according to standard procedures for captured soldiers. A written order was prepared and sent back toward the ruined village at dawn. When the guards received it, the atmosphere shifted once again. There was no announcement to the prisoners, yet the tension in the yard changed. The soldiers were lined up and moved under escort toward a temporary staging point near the outskirts of the village. Their destination was a transit center located deeper in the enemy's rear areas, where conditions were regulated and oversight was stricter. The senior officer who had intervened earlier supervised the transfer. He verified that the guards understood the updated instructions and that no unofficial actions would be tolerated. He inspected the prisoners briefly before departure, noting that their physical state remained stable. Supplies were issued enough to sustain the march to the next checkpoint. The officer recorded the numbers and forwarded the final notes to headquarters before returning to his duties along the front. The column moved slowly through the damaged landscape. Fields were scorched, and abandoned equipment marked the path of recent battles. The prisoners walked in silence, aware that the worst outcome had been avoided. They did not know the details of the investigation, only that the threat hanging over them had lifted. The guards maintained distance but did not display hostility. The march conditions were controlled and predictable, a notable contrast to the uncertainties of the previous days. By midday, the group reached a logistical road used for troop movements. From there, they continued toward the transit center. The facility occupied a fortified compound surrounded by fencing and watchtowers. It served as a temporary location for captured soldiers before they were moved farther into the rear. The prisoners were registered, inspected, and assigned to a holding area. Their treatment aligned with regulations. Food was rationed, medical personnel evaluated those with minor injuries, and administrative staff processed the remaining documentation. Inside the holding area, the prisoners remained under constant supervision. Yet the atmosphere lacked the urgency and threat they had felt earlier. They blended into the larger population of captured soldiers taken in nearby operations. Their future remained uncertain, yet they knew that their lives had been spared due to a decision based on evidence rather than assumption. The senior officer's intervention gradually faded into routine reports and archived correspondence, but its impact persisted. The group that had stood on the brink of execution survived because someone in the chain of command had paused and examined the available facts. In the vast complexity of the war, such decisions often remained unnoticed, overshadowed by larger events. Nevertheless, the outcome demonstrated how a single act of careful judgment could alter the fate of many individuals. For the prisoners, the ordeal became a defining memory of the war. They carried forward the knowledge that survival had depended not on chance, but on a moment when procedure overcame impulse. As the conflict continued to unfold across the continent, their experience became one of countless episodes shaped by shifting lines, incomplete information, and the rare occasions when an officer chose to act with restraint.